Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today we're back to Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. After doing the ARC GPU and the proposed minimum requirement, now I'm doing the real minimum requirement. If you don't remember, the minimum requirement is the Ryzen 5 2600 or the i5 8600K, 8GB of memory and a 6GB of VRAM GPU, either the RX 580 8GB or the GTX 1060 6GB. And with the target as 30 FPS at 1080p with the low presets. Thank you Dev to put that information. If you've watched my proposed minimum requirement for Space Marine 2, the i5 8600K I didn't have, so it was the i5 9600K and we were bottlenecked by the CPU. So I found a way to alleviate the issue, so stay tuned. Welcome to Response PC, I'm Dunk, let's game on. Now the quick disclaimer, I'm always playing on a fresh Windows install with the game install, the driver and the Windows update. No junkware, whateverware install. And for starter, we're going to go with the GTX 900 series. So first off, the 980 Ti. Yes, it should already be better than the 1060 6GB because this is also a 6GB card. And for the CPU, we dropped to the 5th gen, the i7 5920K. This is a 6-core 12-thread CPU compared to the i5 86 or i5 9600K, which are 6-core 6-thread. And this game is CPU thread demanding. And we are at 8GB of system memory, the proposed memory. And as you can see, we can play at 1080p medium settings and reach 36 FPS average. But the CPU usage and GPU usage is having a weird behavior. Some core of the i7 is reaching 100%, so we still have some bottleneck even with that old CPU. And dropping the GPU to the GTX 970. Now we are at a 4GB VRAM card instead, so we are below what the proposed minimum requirement they asked for of 6GB of VRAM. And playing at 1080p low settings, we are just above 30 FPS at 32 FPS. But again, the GPU and CPU giving some weird behavior in the utilization, having the GPU peg at 100% but also sometimes dropping in the mid 70s. Same goes as the CPU. It's wavering up and down easily, and the 8GB of memory is maxed out. So I had the feeling the memory is my bottleneck here that is causing the CPU to bottleneck the rest. And I was right. I had another 8GB for 16GB on the i7 5920K and the GTX 970. So we're now having 16GB of memory and we are averaging 39 FPS. I've seen myself drop only once in the 20 at 29 for a couple seconds. So the minimum requirement maybe should be 16GB because otherwise you're going to bottleneck your system. Because now the GPU is at the most stable at mid-90s percentage of utilization. Same go for the CPU in the 70s to 80s. And we are using 12.4GB of system memory. So the game was asking for more memory and it didn't have it on hand. So my guess is when they test the i5 8600K, they didn't know but they put 16GB of memory in it. Because at 8GB, the CPU is a bottleneck. Lowering down to the GTX 960 4GB variant was a mess. We are averaging 24 FPS and it's a stuttery mess at 1080p low settings. So switching up to 720p, which is below of the minimum requirement proposed of 1080p for 30 FPS, but the option is there. So if you have a 960 4GB variant, you can play. You'll get an average of 36 FPS. The screen will look quite small, but it's playable, I guess. Will I recommend it? Not at all. And you can play at 8GB of system memory also, because out of the 16, I'm only using 6 to 7GB of memory. And CPU utilization is the mid-50s, so we're not bottlenecked by the CPU. Now, since we know the lowest GPU and NVIDIA side we can go is the GTX 970, we can start to drop the CPU. So next up will be the i7 3770. I'm going to try at 8GB and 16GB. So first at 1080p low settings, the 8GB system gave us 34 FPS. But the CPU fluctuates in utilization and the GPU is often find himself in 60 to 70% of utilization. We don't want that. The i7 3770 is only a 4-core 8-thread, so we are 2-thread lower than the i7 5920K, but only at 8GB of system memory, we are stuttering. We are bottlenecking the CPU. with that quantity of memory. Adding the 8GB of system memory missing, meaning at 16, the i7-3770 still seems to be a bottleneck to some level, but the game is way more smoother. I've rarely encountered any stuttering, and the average FPS climb up to 38, so it becomes playable 1080p low settings. Because having 16GB of memory, we're now using 12.2GB of system memory. So the game was asking for it, but it was not available. I feel this is going to be the lowest CPU we can go to play this game, because it's somehow time to time bottlenecking the game. Going lower, I'm going to try. I still have one CPU I want to try. That is the i7-920. I skipped the second gen, I just want to go to the lowest first gen, i7-920. And the CPU is the bottleneck. The GPU is waiting for the CPU. We sometimes go as low in the i40 percentage of utilization for the GPU. The CPU is always in the 90s percentage of utilization. Even with 16GB of memory, we're using 12.1GB, and that to just give it 22 FPS average, and even dropping the resolution to 720p. It's a no-go, because normally it put more strain on the CPU, which is already a bottleneck. So dropping at 720p, the FPS also dropped to 20 FPS. We lost 2 FPS, dropping the resolution. Now on the AMD side of things, from the Ryzen 5 2600, let's drop one generation, the Ryzen 5 1600. This is still a 6-core 12 threads, which the game should love, because there's a 12 thread, back to 8GB of memory, and the RX 570, which is under the RX 580, but the 4GB variant. And for some reason at 1080p, we don't have every asset in the screen. You lose your partner and you don't see any enemies. You need to drop the resolution to 720p to be able to see your friends and foes. That is a nice behavior, because the GTX 970 was also 4GB of VRAM. I don't know why this 4GB of VRAM RX 570 cannot display every assets at 1080p. I know the game has some issue with some AMD. Is it the same cause that causing my current issue at 1080p losing a friend and foe? I don't know. But at least the CPU is not a bottleneck even playing at 8GB of system memory. So to check out if it's the VRAM of the RX 570 4GB is not enough, let's lower to the RX 480 but 8GB. And this apparently solved the problem. We're playing at 1080p, low settings. We are averaging a nice 35 FPS, quite smooth on top of that. The GPU is pegged at 99%, that's what we want, using 4.7 to 5GB of VRAM. The GPU is in the mid-70 utilization, so we're not bottlenecked by the CPU, even though we only have 8GB of memory, using 6.6 to 7GB of system memory. That's really nice to see, because this is really old hardware. You probably can play the game. I still quite recommend to have a 16GB of system memory, but it seems to be able to play perfectly with 8. Dropping the CPU to the Ryzen 5 1500X and keeping the RX 480 8GB, because that seems to be the lowest we can go for AMD side GPU. Now we have a 4-core 8-thread CPU. We have a similar result as the i7-3770, which was a 4-core 8-thread also. We somehow a little bit bound by the CPU. Having always in the mid-90s% of utilization, we have a CPU bottleneck. And it's not even caused by the memory. It's really CPU bottleneck. That's it. We're using 7 to 6.9GB of system memory, and Windows is using about 550, 600 megabyte. We have some place on system memory that is not using. The GPU is waiting for the CPU, but we're still having an average of 31 FPS. So we're just on the mark for the minimum requirement to play the game. 30 FPS, 1080p, low settings. I've included 2 clips of my ARC GPU with Warhammer as for the real minimum requirement, with the i7-8700, because this is the lowest CPU with motherboard that I can have that support resizable bar for the ARC GPU. And the A380 is only a 6GB card, which should be okay, but we are averaging 28 FPS at 1080p low settings. So it's just below of what you should be playing, but it's playable, because sometimes I've reached it under 22 FPS and other times of just over 40 FPS. It's playable, not a stuttery, but the frame rate is not there. The real winner for the Intel GPU should be the A580. This is an 8GB card and we are averaging 40 FPS. The GPU is mostly pegged in the high 90s and the CPU is in the 80 to 90s, so maybe we have some CPU bottleneck. We have 16GB of memory, so maybe 32, I don't know, but we're using only 13.8GB of system system memory. But that should be our winner, because there's not much GPU to test. It's only the first generation on the market so far, until the Battle Mage come on the market. Maybe they have even more range of middle to low end GPU. But the A580 is definitely our winner for the real minimum requirement. To finish up this video, I went back to the proposed minimum requirement. I mean, I went back to my i5 9600K, the GTX 1060 6GB, but this time instead of 8GB of memory, I've used 32. And this game is drinking system memory like it was a college student drinking all its loan. Because out of 32GB of system memory, we're using 18.7 to 19.1GB of system memory. And we are still CPU bottleneck. It's in the high 90s to 100% all the time. The GPU also, so it's quite even. But now with that kind of memory, at least we don't have any stutter anymore. And not only that, we passed from 39 FPS when we're playing at 8GB of system memory to 51 FPS average. This is quite a jump just by adding some memory. So who's the winner for the real minimum requirement? For GPU side, Intel will be the A580, Nvidia the GTX 970, and AMD the RX 480 8GB variant. For CPU side, the Ryzen 5 1500X with 8GB of memory. For Intel side, the i7 3770 with 16GB of memory. I'm probably going to have a patch in the future for performance issue for CPU usage and memory usage, but for now, this is what you have to play the game properly. 30 FPS, 1080p, low settings. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.